Hello and welcome to week 9 of the DRK March to May Knit Along weekly Q&A. I wanted to start off this week by actually asking all of you. I have been getting some emails and comments and questions about if I will keep this series going after the Knit Along ends. So I thought I would ask all of you if that is something that you would like to see me do. Would you like this series to continue? Are you gonna keep sending me in questions? We've got quite a few. I mean, I can go for a while after with the ones we have. But yeah, let me know, and I will definitely see if it's something that I can continue to fit into my schedule. Today, I'm actually wearing some of my really early patterns. This is the Open Sky shawl and my white pine sweater, which I love the details on. It has this garter detail and a slip stitch kind of faux seam, and then the details mirrored on the sleeves as well. This is actually my first sweater design, and this was a collaboration I did with my knitting bestie Annie Rowden from By Annie Claire. We had a little collaboration called Naturally Straightforward. So we worked on pieces that were centered around naturally dyed yarn, and we focused on lines in our work. So hence the garter lines here, and then there's lines throughout this shawl using both lace and garter. I used Swan's Island All-American worsted for the yarn for both of these. It's a really lovely yarn. It's a woolen spun. It's naturally dyed here in Maine. So anyways, I'll link to these in the notes, and let's dive into some questions. I'm gonna take a little sip of water. I've got a dry throat today. Okay. I've always wondered what it's like to only knit your own designs as a designer. Can you talk about your feelings around that and what it's like to see new designs that you love and might otherwise knit if you weren't a designer yourself? Thank you so much. Yeah, so I always intended to continue knitting other people's designs. There's so many innovative, amazing designers out there creating just beautiful patterns. So for a number of years, I continued to buy patterns. I wanted to support my fellow designers. And it would kind of be like around my birthday or the holidays, I would tell myself, okay, I'm gonna give myself some like selfish knitting time. And what ended up happening is I pretty much always, about halfway through the pattern, it would end up in a project bag. I just didn't really have the time. But I also think that once my designer brain turned on, it just doesn't turn back off. And so I end up sitting there trying to knit, like follow a pattern, which seems like it'll be so relaxing, but then I just keep thinking of like my own ideas and, oh, I really want to get started on that. And it just didn't end up being kind of what I thought it would be. So finally, I just realized right now in my life, I don't really have the time for it. But you know, I daydream that someday I'm gonna have time to try out some of those patterns, that are just so cool, that are very different from my own, that I have like really interesting construction and all these things. Someday I'm gonna do it. But yeah, right now I just find the most joy in letting my brain kind of do its thing, and that creative space for me really, really fills me up. So, all right, question number 2, how big is your stash and how do you organize it? Do you generally start with a particular yarn and decide what it should become, or do you choose a project and then find the perfect yarn for it? How often do you incorporate stash yarn into your projects? So I do have a big yarn collection. You know, when it's your job, it becomes very easy to justify, and I like to try out a lot of different yarns. But I've definitely become very conscious of trying to really make sure I'm not just buying yarn to buy yarn. I want to use what I've purchased. There is some yarn that over the years I've realized, you know, I don't think this actually fits really my style or my aesthetic or whatever it may be. And so I do like to kind of clear out my yarn collection. I've donated quite a bit of it. There's all kinds. If you ever do have yarn kind of languishing in your stash that you don't think you'll use, there are lots of people who will use up that yarn. There's lots of hospitals, especially like NICUs, that will use that yarn to knit up little baby hats. When my daughter was in hospital, we were in the NICU with her for a couple of weeks, and it was amazing seeing a lot of the nurses and the hospital staff would knit up little loveys and hats and things for these babies. So they can always use that yarn. A lot of women's shelters will take that yarn and use it for the women that are staying there to teach them how to knit. There's a lot of places. So that's one thing that I do to kind of keep my yarn collection in check. But generally, let me reread this part. Do you generally start with a particular yarn and then choose the project, or choose the project and then find the perfect yarn? So originally I really felt like the yarn told me what it wanted to be, but now I find it's kind of 50-50 split. There are definitely projects that I think of the idea and then I turn to my shelves and I find the yarn I think will suit. But a lot of times there's yarn that I see sitting together. Last week's video, if you go back to week 8, you'll see I'm wearing my striped sweater. I had gotten that yarn from the Farmer's Daughter Fibers, and I'd already had some of her O'Dang, which is her Surrey alpaca yarn. And I had those yarns sitting next to each other and I knew I had to use them together. So a lot of times it is the yarn will say, like, we have to be used together. You got to figure out how to use this together. So it can definitely kind of go both ways. And yes, I absolutely incorporate stash yarn into my projects, into my designs. As my business has shifted throughout the years, I actually generally err on the side of I prefer to purchase yarn. So I can support yarn companies and indie yarn dyers, and that way I can give the yarn the time to kind of tell me what it wants to be. So I kind of consider all my yarn my stash, and I try to shop from those shelves to do my designs and my projects. And I have to say, it's just so satisfying. I'm curious if you all feel similarly to when you do use that yarn, especially if it's been in your stash for a while and then you use it. It's like the best feeling. I love doing that. So, all right. Is there anything I would need to do if I am knitting a project with several hand-dyed hanks of the same color yarn? I've scrolled past something about knitting from different hanks at the same time, but can't find that info again. So this is a great question. A lot of indie dyers will recommend this, even if you are using yarn that was dyed at the same time. Due to different dye processes, even yarns that were dyed at the same time can vary. And so they will recommend that you basically stripe with those yarns. And so you would knit, every other row or every few rows going back and forth between those two different skeins of yarn. I will admit, and my dyer friends won't appreciate it, but I don't think I've ever alternated my skeins, and I've never really had a problem. But, I tend to find that the second I say that, I all of a sudden have that problem. So I should knock on wood here. But yeah, I generally don't like to fiddle with that. So I don't, but I haven't been burned in that way. I know that people have. So if the dyer, and you can usually find it on the label, a lot of times different dyers will say, like, we recommend alternating skeins. And what they mean by that is you knit one to a couple of rows or rounds and then switch to the other skein. So you would have 2 balls of yarn and you'd go back and forth, and it's just going to give you a much smoother finished fabric as far as color goes. And I just always carry my yarn up the inside of the project. The one thing to take care with is you just don't want to pull that yarn up really tight because you don't want it to pucker. Sometimes to ensure I'm keeping it loose enough, I actually stick my finger there as I'm carrying it up to give it like a little boost. If it's quite a few rows, I'll even like pinch it and then knit my first stitch so that I'm leaving a little loop, because what I find happens with that little loop is after blocking and wearing, it kind of shimmies itself into place. And it's better to have a wee bit extra than to have it be too tight and deal with puckering or something that won't stretch the way you want it to. But if the less rows you're jumping, the easier it is to carry that yarn up. So you might even want to do every other row. Again, I kind of showed this trick in week 8, but a great way to see if two skeins are going to be similar. Whenever I'm doing this, I'm looking for yarn. I often have yarn right here behind me. But for instance, you know, if I have 2 skeins of the same color, what I might do is open them both up. So actually take your label off and untwist the yarn. And I like to I call it yarn spaghetti. So I would put that on the ground and kind of open it up a little. And then I would take my other skein and put it next to it. And I would see how similar they look. It's best to do it in natural light so you can see the nuances. But if they look super similar, you probably don't need to alternate skeins, says me. But of course, listen to the dyer over me. But if you can see differences, what you don't want is basically what looks like a color blocked sweater. I have had where I accidentally used a different dye lot in the middle of a sweater. And so it's like dark gray, and in the middle is this lighter gray band. That doesn't look very good. So that's what you're trying to avoid. That's why you want to alternate skeins. All right. Oh, I copied 2 of the same questions. Well, we might only do 4 questions today because I don't know how I managed to do that. All right. I like the look of using a pale colored yarn with a dark yarn in the same project. How do you prevent the darker yarn from bleeding into the paler yarn? So remember earlier how I said I jinxed myself by saying I've never had a problem with that. So I had never, up until a month ago, had any issues with, sorry, my screen got really bright. There we go. I have never, up until very recently, had any issues with color bleeding. And I've been knitting, since I was about 9, and I've been designing, and I almost always use more than one color in my projects. It's very common for me to do that. And I never had issues with color bleeding until recently. And it was actually surprising. It wasn't a very dark color that bled. So here's my recommendations. If you're worried about color bleeding, because I've also used black and white together, and the dyer even told me these might bleed, and they didn't. So the best thing you can do is before you start that project, just snip a little bit of each yarn and put them together in a bowl of hot water. And if they don't bleed together in that bowl of hot water, they're probably not going to bleed in your finished project. So that's going to tell you a little bit if they're safe to use together. Another option would be to knit your swatch using both colors and then wet block that in hot water. So if that's okay, then you're probably good to go. But in general, to avoid bleeding, what you want to do, especially if it's an animal fiber, is you want to keep the cuticle on that fiber closed. And the easiest way to do that is with cold water. So hot water makes hair or animal hair and fur, it makes the cuticles open up, and that allows color both to go in and out. So if the water's cold, it'll help keep that down, which will help the color stay in your dark color, and it'll help it stay out of your light color. You can also use something called a color catcher. I have not used it before, but I always hear it in my classes. I've heard a lot of people recommend them. They've had great luck with them. I think you can buy them maybe at the grocery store, online. Try searching color catcher. But that you put in with the wash in it catches the color. You can also add a little bit of vinegar to the water, and that can help. But that's generally my tips. Again, I definitely would test those colors together because it's not fun to finish a whole project and realize, oh man, these bled, and it doesn't, and it's not like it's gonna bleed evenly. You're probably gonna have splotches of color, and with the effort we put into our knits, we definitely don't want that to happen afterwards. But don't be afraid to use those high contrast colors together. Just check them out beforehand. Again, you know, in almost 30 years of knitting, I've had it happen once. So odds are you're going to be okay. And a lot of dyers, again, they usually do say something like if they have a color they know is prone to bleeding, a lot of times they will kind of mention that either on the label or on their website. And so that would be a good one to know, like, oh, okay, that I need to either use on its own or with like colors. So, all right, well, I guess that's it for this week. I will be back next week, and I hope y'all have a wonderful weekend. Happy knitting.